The prairie stretched endless, a land of dust and quiet winds that seemed older than memory. A silence that pressed against the skin until even the sound of a heartbeat felt too loud. South Dakota in the year 1884 was not yet the land of railroads and cities, but a raw wilderness where small towns clung to life like stubborn weeds, their wooden buildings groaning against storms that came without warning. The settlers who came here spoke often of God and destiny, of the promise of a life carved from soil, but there was always something beneath their words, an unease that could not be named. They worked hard by day, prayed hard by night, and still felt the cold crawl of the silence that rolled across the fields. It was not the silence of peace, but of something waiting. This silence was heaviest on the hill just outside the town, a hill of dark grass and rock that locals avoided, though no one admitted why. They said the land was too thin there, the soil not right for crops, but the truth lay in the way animals refused to graze at its base, in the way even birds circled wide to avoid it. At night the hill seemed to pulse with its own stillness, not soundless but rather full of something hidden, as if the air itself was holding back a breath. The first settlers spoke of it in hushed tones, some saying it reminded them of the burial grounds of the tribes who once roamed here. Others swore the earth was hollow, that water beneath carried whispers through the soil. No one built on it. No one stayed near it for long, until the Kessler family arrived. They came from the east, German immigrants carrying little more than a wagon, tools, and a fierce will to claim a piece of land. To them the hill was perfect, high ground that offered view and pride, a place where they could build something that would not be washed away in spring floods. Neighbors watched with quiet dread as the foundation of their home was laid, each strike of hammer and each cut of wood ringing out across the prairie like a warning that went unheard. The silence grew heavier as the house rose, a structure too neat, too exact, every corner squared as if measured not by hand, but by something precise and cold. The windows seemed to stare, the roof steep as though leaning into the sky, and by the time it stood finished, the townsfolk had stopped speaking of it in daylight. They called it simply the house on the hill, but at night they whispered other things. Still, the Kesslers seemed untouched by worry, carrying themselves with the calm pride of people who believed their hard work had tamed the land. Their children ran in the fields, their cattle grazed at the edges where other animals would not, and though the wind pressed harder against their walls than anywhere else, they laughed as if nothing were wrong. Yet when storms came, lightning seemed to strike closer to the house than to any other part of the prairie, and sometimes on still nights, neighbors swore they saw faint lights moving behind the windows even when the lamps inside were dark. Some said the family had a gift, that they had built something blessed. Others muttered cursed, but none dared confront them. In town, the preacher spoke of faith stronger than fear, yet even his sermons held a tremor when the house was mentioned. The silence of the prairie had changed. It no longer lay flat across the land, but seemed to pool around that hill waiting for something to wake. The settlers who once only feared wolves and storms began locking their doors tighter, not knowing why, not admitting what gnawed in their bones. The children played less near the fields that led to the hill. Dogs barked at night without reason. And in that silence, Heinrich Kessler, still a boy, sat at the base of the new house, his small hands dragging in the dirt, drawing circles no one wanted to understand. The prairie had always been quiet, but now it was a different quiet. Not the absence of sound, but the arrival of something unspoken. It was a silence that belonged not to the land, but to the house that rose above it. And it was only the beginning. The house rose slow and steady on the hill, timber by timber, each nailed board echoing down the valley like the toll of a muted bell. To the Kesslers it was only a house, a proud mark of their hard labor, but to the town it was something else, an interruption in the land, an unnatural shape cutting against the sky. Its walls stood too perfect, not the rough patchwork of other settlers' homes, but angled and exact, every joint measured with a precision no farmer should have known. The roof was steeper than need demanded, sharp as a blade pointed toward the clouds, and the windows seemed to watch, 4 black eyes staring out over the prairie as if the house itself were keeping count of the world below. The neighbors had tried at first to welcome the Kesslers. Bread was offered, tools were shared, but few stayed long in that place. They said the air on the hill was heavy, thick enough to slow the breath, and the silence inside the house was worse than outside. No creak of settling wood, no soft whistle of drafts, not even the chirp of insects daring to crawl the walls. Just stillness like stepping into a sealed box where time held its breath. When visitors left, they did so quickly, wiping sweat from their brows as though escaping a fever they could not name. For Heinrich, the youngest of the children, the house was a world of endless corners. He wandered through it with a kind of awe, his fingertips brushing each wall as if they carried messages only he could hear. At night he slept soundless while his siblings stirred and complained of restless dreams. They spoke of footsteps pacing when no one moved, of shadows too thick for the lantern's glow, but Heinrich only smiled, saying the house liked them, that it wanted them safe. His parents dismissed it as childish talk, but the boy's stillness grew unsettling. He listened more than he spoke, eyes fixed on things no one else could see. Strange details began to cling to the place. During the first harvest, the crops near the base of the hill blackened early, while the fields farther away remained green. Cattle brought too close to the barn would buck and thrash, eyes rolling white until pulled away. The preacher, on his single visit, lingered outside before entering. He touched the door frame with his hand, then withdrew it quickly as though burned. When he left, he told no one what he had felt, only that the Kesslers were good folk, God-fearing and hard-working. But the way he gripped his Bible tighter after that day did not go unnoticed. Inside, the house grew into its own character. Its hallways stretched longer at night, the air colder in the cellar than the earth should have allowed. Guests remarked that voices carried strangely, bouncing back in whispers as though the walls themselves were repeating the words. The Kesslers adjusted, living in it as one lives with an illness, ignoring what could not be cured. The mother scrubbed harder, the father hammered nails into boards that did not need fixing, as if work itself could keep unease away. But Heinrich simply watched, drawing his spirals in dust, tracing patterns on window glass with his fingertip until breath fogged the pane. By the second winter, the house had earned a reputation. Neighbors avoided the path near the hill, and when asked why, they shrugged, unwilling to put into words what they felt. They did not know how to explain the sensation of eyes at their back when passing, or the way the wind seemed to still itself around the house while it howled elsewhere. Children dared one another to run up the slope and touch the door, but even the boldest refused to cross the threshold. One boy, braver than most, swore he heard humming from inside, though the house was dark and no one stood at the window. The Kesslers lived quietly, attending church, selling goods at market, never giving reason for suspicion. Yet whispers spread. Some said the family had built the house according to old German plans, designs meant to bind spirits or trap demons. Others said the land itself was cursed, and the house had only awakened what slept beneath. No one could explain why they felt the hill differently now than before the walls stood upon it. What had been merely avoided land was now something else entirely, claimed, possessed, alive. One evening, as the sun sank blood-red, a farmhand passing by saw young Heinrich kneeling in the dirt beside the barn. He was not playing as boys did, not chasing beetles or carving sticks, but marking the earth with precise circles one within another, each line smooth as if cut by compass. The farmhand called out, but Heinrich did not look up. His hand moved steady, deliberate, until the circle was closed, and then he placed a stone in the center with great care, as though finishing something important. Only then did he lift his gaze. The farmhand swore later the boy's eyes were not those of a child, but of someone older, someone watching him instead of seeing him. He left quickly, telling no one until years later. The house stood quiet, its windows dark, but from that night forward the neighbors began to say the silence on the prairie had changed again. It was not just heavy now, it was listening. The house on the hill had become a thing apart from the family that built it, a place that breathed in shadows, a place that seemed to wait. Heinrich grew up in the shadow of the house, a boy too quiet for his years, his hands always stained with dirt, not from play but from the patterns he carved into the ground. Other children built forts from branches or chased each other through the fields, but Heinrich crouched low, his finger moving in deliberate arcs, drawing circles upon circles, spirals that coiled into themselves until the earth looked branded with marks no one could understand. His teachers tried to correct him, calling his drawings distractions, but he never stopped. Even on the slates used for lessons when asked to write sums or letters, he returned to those spirals, darkening the lines until chalk dust covered his hands. At first it seemed harmless. The boy was shy, thoughtful, perhaps slow to join others. But as the circles spread, unease grew. They were not careless scribbles. They had form, symmetry, precision. Too precise. The older folk began to murmur that no child should know such patterns, that they resembled diagrams better suited to astronomers or scholars of machines. Farmers who had little patience for strangeness avoided looking at them too long. There was something about the way the spirals narrowed, trapping the eye, forcing it inward, that made the viewer dizzy. Some said staring long enough brought a kind of sickness, as though the lines were not just shapes but a path meant to pull you down. Heinrich never explained them. When pressed, he only shrugged or whispered that the circles helped him listen. Listen to what? No one asked, though the thought lingered heavy in their minds. His family grew uneasy too, especially his older brothers, who scolded him for wasting time. They tried to scrape away the patterns, but by morning new ones appeared, carved deeper into the soil. His mother, torn between fear and tenderness, began saving scraps of paper for him, hoping he would confine his markings there. Soon stacks of sheets filled with endless spirals gathered in corners of the house, tucked beneath his bed, slipped into cracks of the barn. One night during supper, the father noticed Heinrich's plate untouched, his eyes fixed not on food but on the wood grain of the table. His finger traced the lines in the timber, following them into new spirals only he could see. When his mother tried to move his hand, he pulled away sharply, his expression flat, eyes black as stone. For a moment she swore she did not recognize her son. The moment passed, but it left a scar of unease that never healed. The circles began appearing outside the family's land, in the schoolyard scratched into frost, along the riverbank pressed into mud with small bare feet, once carved into the bark of a tree so high no child should have been able to reach. The townsfolk whispered louder now, some claiming witchcraft, others madness. The preacher tried prayer, holding a hand over the boy's head during Sunday service, but Heinrich only smiled, a small private smile that made even the preacher falter. By the time he turned 12, animals refused to linger near him. Dogs whined and pulled their chains when he approached. Horses shifted violently if his hand reached for their reins. Even cattle, docile by nature, backed away when he entered the pen, their large eyes wide with something like recognition. His siblings avoided him too, growing resentful of the strange attention he drew. Yet Heinrich remained calm, detached, watching the world as though already apart from it. The townsfolk grew wary of the Kessler family, though no one confronted them. To speak of such things openly felt dangerous, as if giving words to their fear would make it real. Instead, the community pulled back, invitations went unspoken, and the family found themselves isolated on the hill. It was as though the house and the boys' circles formed a barrier, pushing others away, leaving them to live in a silence that deepened with every year. Late one evening, a neighbor cutting across the field saw Heinrich in the moonlight, crouched low, his hand carving something larger than usual into the dirt. It was not a circle this time, but many spirals knotted together, overlapping like gears in motion. In the center, a dark pit had been dug, its edges sharp and clean. The boy leaned close, whispering into it as though speaking to someone below. The neighbor turned back quickly, fear burning in his chest, unwilling to look longer. But he told his wife the next day that he heard an answer rise from that pit, faint but not the voice of a child. From then on, the circles stopped being seen as childish oddities. They became warnings, marks left by something unearthly wearing the shape of a boy. Heinrich's parents, though devout, no longer spoke of God's will in the same way. Their prayers grew louder, their faces worn, the mother's hands trembled when she crossed herself at night, and the father began carrying a knife, though no wolves prowled near. They were not protecting themselves from the land anymore, but from what had grown within their own walls. And still Heinrich drew, tireless, patient, as if mapping something only he could see. Each spiral seemed to push him further from the world of other children, further from the family who once held him close. He was listening to something, waiting for something, and whatever it was, it had already begun to answer. The winter of 1884 came early, the kind that froze cattle in the field and split wood at Its core. Men worked until their hands bled, women prayed until their voices cracked. Yet the silence on the prairie only deepened. That winter, Elijah Morrow, a 19-year-old farmhand hired by the Kesslers, vanished. Elijah was strong, good-natured, and grateful for work. The kind of boy who whistled while he chopped wood. He had been seen heading toward the Kessler barn one evening, his breath rising in clouds against the dusk, a lantern swinging at his side. By morning, the lantern lay broken near the barn door, but Elijah was gone. At first, the family claimed he must have run off. Men that age often drifted west, chasing gold or rail work, leaving no word behind. But Elijah had left his coat, his boots, even his Bible tucked under the mattress in the loft where he slept. No man runs into a prairie winter barefoot. The townsfolk began to murmur some whispering wolves had taken him, though no blood trails marked the snow. Others thought he'd fallen through ice, though no ponds nearby were broken. Only one detail set their teeth on edge. The barn floor was scrubbed too clean. When neighbors came to help search, they noticed Heinrich standing near the door, his eyes fixed on a single spot in the planks. The boy did not speak, but when the men lifted the boards, they found dark stains beneath, stains that seeped deeper than the wood should have allowed. The air hung heavy with an iron scent, faint but unmistakable. Heinrich did not flinch. He only kept staring as though listening to something whispering through the cracks. The search spread across fields and ravines, but no sign of Elijah was ever found. Some men claimed their dogs picked up a trail that circled back toward the hill before vanishing altogether, as though the boy had walked into the house itself and never walked out again. Whispers grew bolder now. Some swore they had seen a dim glow through the barn slats late at night, not lantern light, but a pale shimmer like moonlight trapped indoors. Others claimed they heard strange sounds, not screams, but long-drawn breaths, broken rhythms like someone's body being forced to bend. The Kesslers denied everything, insisting Elijah had left of his own will. Yet even their voices carried strain. The father worked harder in town, speaking loud and often as though trying to prove his normalcy. The mother grew thinner, her face hollow, her prayers whispered fast beneath her breath. And Heinrich. He seemed untouched, quiet as ever, circling his fingers through frost on the windows, drawing patterns that melted slow in the cold. His teachers noted his silence deepened after Elijah's disappearance. He no longer answered questions at all, only sat still, staring at his slate until the chalk cracked under pressure from his hand. One night, weeks after Elijah vanished, a neighbor walking home from market swore he saw movement in the barn. The light was faint, like embers breathing, and inside a shadow shifted, taller than any man, but bending, twisting in jerks too unnatural for bone and muscle. He told no one, not until years later when silence had long turned into legend. The town carried on as prairie towns must. Crops had to be planted, animals fed, children kept alive. But the story of Elijah never faded. His mother came often to the Kessler farm, asking questions, her face raw from weeping. The Kesslers offered her tea, comfort, words of faith. Yet Heinrich only stared at her hands, his gaze fixed on the trembling veins that ran beneath her skin. Watching with such intensity, she left quickly, clutching her shawl tight. The barn itself changed in the minds of the people. No one wished to enter, not even during the day. Men claimed the air inside pressed down too hard, heavier than it should, while animals refused to cross the threshold. The cattle balked, pulling against their ropes, while horses trembled, eyes rolling white. The floor was swept each morning, yet always seemed damp, as though the wood would never dry. When the thaw came, the river broke its ice, carrying branches and bones downstream. Most were from deer. Winter kills swept into the current, but among them was one small fragment, too smooth, too pale, shaped like a piece of a human rib. It washed up near the mill where a child found it and carried it home. His mother threw it into the fire at once, crossing herself as she did, and told no one outside her family. The town, unwilling to accuse without proof, wrapped its silence tighter. They told themselves Elijah had wandered west, that the land swallowed him, that wolves had dragged him off. But in quiet moments, when the winds howled through the plains, they thought of the house on the hill, of the boy who drew circles, and of the barn where the boards never dried. Heinrich himself grew taller that spring, his face narrowing, his eyes sharper. To anyone who looked close, he seemed less child, more vessel, someone carrying something too old, too heavy, too deliberate for youth. And though no one dared ask what he knew of Elijah, the boy's silence told them enough. Something had begun, something that would not end with one missing farmhand. The hill had claimed its first, and the prairie silence was no longer silence at all. It was hunger. Heinrich's youth stretched into manhood like a shadow growing longer across the prairie, quiet and steady, unbroken by storms or seasons. He became tall, slender and solemn, his face smooth, but his eyes already lined with a stillness that unnerved anyone who met them. He was polite, gentle in speech, never raising his voice, never rushing his words. Neighbors called him respectful, disciplined, even pious. He carried himself like a man carved from restraint, the kind who bowed his head in church and worked without complaint. Yet beneath that surface, something darker had taken root, something that wore manners like a mask. Heinrich's interest in the body grew early, nurtured by the rural doctor who sometimes visited the town. While others shrank from the sight of blood or broken bones, Heinrich leaned closer, asking quiet questions, watching intently as wounds were stitched and limbs reset. The doctor saw promise in the boy, mistaking his cold fascination for diligence, and began to teach him small things: how to bind a wound, how to feel for a pulse, how to drain infection with a careful hand. Heinrich absorbed it all, his mind a ledger of methods and tools, though the hunger in his gaze unsettled even the seasoned physician. By the time he reached 18, Heinrich could be trusted to assist, his hands steady as stone. But in secret he went further. Alone in the barn by lantern light, he experimented on small animals. Rabbits, stray dogs, birds caught in traps. He did not harm them out of rage or impulse, but out of a detached curiosity that bordered on ritual. He studied the way nerves stretched, how muscles quivered when wires were heated and pressed against them, how long breath lingered when the lungs were compressed slowly instead of crushed. He learned to stop bleeding without healing, to silence a heart without spilling blood, to bend the body until the mind broke first. His cruelty was not wild but methodical, each act recorded in crude drawings and marks in a ledger no one else was meant to see. To the outside world, Heinrich remained a quiet helper. He assisted births, pulled teeth, and stitched wounds, earning thanks and trust. Families welcomed him into their homes, believing him a gift to the town, a man of science in a place still ruled by superstition. Mothers sent their sons to him when sick. Fathers nodded approval when he entered a room, and even the preacher blessed his steady hands. They did not see the other side, the patience with which he prolonged suffering in his experiments, the fascination with thresholds. How much a body could endure before mind or spirit faltered. He was not cruel for pleasure. He was cruel for knowledge, and knowledge to him was devotion. The house on the hill became his sanctuary. Its rooms were not simply shelter, but chambers of observation. He marked walls with faint lines, circles etched with nails just beneath the plaster. Geometric forms that seemed meaningless to anyone else but mapped something precise in his mind. The cellar, colder than the earth around it, became his laboratory. Here he refined his methods, stripping life apart in ways no one spoke of, then reassembling what was left as if the body were only another machine. The silence of the prairie wrapped the house like a shroud, muffling every sound, allowing him to work without fear of interruption. Heinrich studied not only flesh, but the absence of it, the moment between living and dying, the sliver of silence when the body still twitched though breath had ceased. He pressed fingers to eyelids, waiting for the last flutter. He pinched veins until blood slowed like syrup, recording the exact time before collapse. He learned how to stretch sinew into postures impossible for life, forcing bones to curve in spirals, leaving no visible mark except the distortion itself. He began to see bodies not as people but as instruments, each tendon and nerve a string to be plucked, each cry of pain a note in a larger song only he could hear. And all the while the town admired him. They said his manners made him trustworthy, that his silence meant he carried no pride. Young women looked at him with shy respect, though none grew close. He was always polite, always distant, always watching. Some said he was shy. Others said he was simply serious. Only a few, mostly children, whispered that his eyes were wrong, too still, too heavy, like looking into water that had no bottom. The turning point came when he began treating more than illness. Families who brought their sick to him sometimes found them returned weakened, more fragile, as if something had been taken from them during healing. Yet no proof remained. Heinrich left no scars, no visible injuries. The patients only complained of strange dreams, of limbs that felt heavy, of whispers in their sleep. These stories spread quietly, dismissed by most, but they marked the beginning of his true work. He was no longer satisfied with animals or private experiments. He wanted to test endurance in those who trusted him, to explore how close he could push them to silence without crossing it fully. To watch him, one would never guess. He walked through town with his Bible in hand, nodded to neighbors, smiled faintly at children. He gave food to widows, medicine to the poor, kindness to all. But beneath the mask of civility, he was assembling something greater than any one experiment. He was building a system, a method of cruelty disguised as mercy, refining a language of pain only he could speak. In the quiet of his journals, he wrote that life was not sacred but fragile, that suffering revealed the truth of the soul. He believed the house demanded it, that each experiment was not his own will but obedience. Whether he was serving science, madness, or something older still, no one could say. But already beneath the calm surface the shape of a monster had formed, not a beast with fangs or fury, but a quiet man with steady hands, who hid his devotion behind gentleness, who carried evil not in rage, but in silence. And in that silence the prairie listened. Heinrich's work shifted from private experiment to deliberate ritual, each act repeating with the precision of a craftsman. What began with animals now demanded human endurance. Victims were lured to the house under pretense of treatment. Farmers with sore backs, children with fevers, wives with headaches. They entered trusting the calm voice and steady hands, never knowing the cellar was already prepared. There he perfected what he called the spiral method. With heated wires he traced along nerves, not to kill, but to bend the body inward. He forced limbs into twisted arcs, holding them there until muscles froze, as though sculpting flesh into shapes that defied life. Pain was not his goal. It was a byproduct. What he sought was transformation, the point where body and will fractured and no longer belonged to the person but to him. He recorded every reaction in his ledger. How long before the voice broke into screams, how long before silence followed, how long the heart resisted once the mind surrendered. He believed suffering revealed patterns hidden beneath the human shell, patterns only he and the house understood. Each body became another circle in the great design, another whisper feeding the silence that clung to the walls. The town noticed the disappearances, farmhands who never returned, women gone missing after errands. But no evidence pointed toward Heinrich. He remained the gentle healer, the quiet son of the hill. While in secret he stretched human forms into spirals until they ceased to resemble the living at all. In his journals he wrote that the house was teaching him, guiding his hand, shaping him into its instrument. And in the stillness of the prairie night, it seemed true. The house had given him a method, and Heinrich had given it a choir of broken bodies to sing its silence. The cellar became more than a place of broken bodies. It became a chamber of voices. Heinrich had grown obsessed with sound, the way screams rose, cracked, and finally faded into silence. He believed the voice was the soul's last defense, and if he could capture it, he could preserve the very essence of a person. His spiral method had shown him how bodies bent, but now he wanted to know how voices lingered. After each ritual, he cut with precision, harvesting the vocal cords of the dying. He handled them not as flesh, but as relics, placing them in jars of alcohol that glimmered in lamplight. The cords floated pale and string-like, and Heinrich swore when he tapped the glass he could hear faint vibrations, echoes of prayers and cries that refused to die. He arranged the jars on shelves in patterns that mirrored the circles he drew as a child, convinced the arrangement itself gave them harmony. At night, when the town lay silent, he descended into the cellar and sat among them listening. He believed the jars whispered. Some begged for release, others hummed faint hymns, but most simply breathed, a low, collective sigh that filled the dark. He called them his choir. To him they were not trophies of cruelty, but proof that the house had chosen him to preserve voices the world would forget. He even began humming back, matching tones only he seemed to hear, joining what he believed was a chorus beyond mortal sound. The Kesslers above pretended not to know. His mother prayed louder each night, drowning out noises from below while his father's face hardened into stone. never asking questions he feared he already knew the answers to. Visitors, when they came, remarked on the strange smell of spirits that clung to the house, sharp and chemical, but Heinrich assured them it was medicine. They nodded, unsettled, and left quickly. By now the disappearances could not be ignored. Families whispered of loved ones who had walked toward the hill and never returned. Yet no proof surfaced, no remains were found, nothing but rumors and the chilling silence that followed each name. Still Heinrich moved among them with calm eyes and folded hands, his reputation as healer shielding him from suspicion. The truth was hidden in his cellar, where shelves lined with jars seemed to breathe with every draft of cold air. The prairie had always been silent, but now it carried a different hush, a quiet that seemed to lean toward the house as if listening with the rest of the choir. And in that gathering of stolen voices, Heinrich believed he had found his purpose. Not merely to break the body, but to keep the echo of suffering alive forever. The winter of 1884 closed its fist over the prairie with a cruelty that felt almost deliberate. Snow fell early and thick, burying crops before they could be harvested, freezing the earth until no spade could break it. Livestock collapsed in the fields, their ribs showing through skin, their bodies stiff in the white drifts. The townsfolk tightened their belts, prayed harder, and rationed what little remained. Hunger became a shadow in every home. It was the kind of winter that made people whisper about God's wrath, or worse, that the land itself had turned against them. And in that famine, people began to vanish. At first, it was explained away. A drifter gone to seek warmer places, a widow taken in by distant kin. But soon the absences were too many, too close, too strange. A young girl sent to fetch water never returned. Two brothers went hunting and left no tracks back in the snow. Their families searched for days. Their names shouted into the frozen winds, but only silence answered. The town whispered of wolves, of starvation-driven madness, of cannibals in the woods. But always their eyes drifted, even unwillingly, toward the hill. Inside the Kessler house, Heinrich worked as if untouched by the cold. The cellar burned with the warmth of lanterns, its air thick with smoke and chemicals, a place where famine did not exist. Here the spiral method and the harvested choir fused into something greater. The victims he lured were no longer only experiments. They were instruments for the house, offerings arranged into designs that grew larger, more complex. Their bones, once discarded, he began to place with intention. Cleaned and whitened, they formed geometric patterns across the floor. Circles interlocked with triangles, spirals folding into spirals. The arrangement resembled no faith the town knew, but Heinrich believed it gave breath to the house itself. He said the walls seemed to exhale when the bones were set in place, that the floor pulsed faintly underfoot as though alive. In his ledger he wrote of buildings, a lung for the house, a body of silence that could inhale their suffering and return it as strength. He spoke of the winter not as misfortune but as opportunity, the hunger of the land feeding the hunger of his work. When the thaw came early in March, hunters stumbled across a clearing not far from the hill. At first they thought it a graveyard. Snow melted faster there as though warmth lingered beneath. What they found sent them running. Bones lay scattered in perfect shapes, ribs curved into circles, skulls placed at points of a star. No animals had torn them, no weather had broken them. They were arranged by deliberate hands. The hunters said nothing at first, swearing themselves to silence, but their faces told the town enough. The prairie had yielded evidence, and it was not the work of wolves. Still, no one dared accuse the Kesslers. Families depended on Heinrich's knowledge, his medicine, his calm voice. To speak aloud what many already feared felt dangerous, as though naming it would invite it upon themselves. Instead, the town invented other stories, starving families turning on each other, strangers passing through in the night. Anything but the truth. Yet behind closed doors, mothers held their children tighter, and men barred their doors with more than wood. They prayed as if prayer itself were the only barrier against the hill. For Heinrich, the winter was not a season of loss, but of abundance. His cellar filled with voices preserved in jars, shelves crowded with the silent choir, while bones above traced patterns that only he and the house understood. Each disappearance, each broken body was another step toward what he believed the house wanted. Breath, sound, life reshaped into silence. And when neighbors passed by in the thaw, they swore the house on the hill seemed different. Its windows no longer looked empty, but lit faintly from within, though no lamp burned. Some said they heard faint humming carried on the wind. Others claimed the snow near the house melted faster than anywhere else. The famine had starved the town, but the house had feasted. And in the spring light it stood heavier, darker, as though the winter had only fed its hunger. By the spring thaw, Heinrich had perfected his disguise. To the town he was no longer the quiet boy who drew circles, but a man of measured kindness, a healer who never refused the poor. He carried himself with calm humility, tending to coughs, setting broken bones, even sitting with the dying when no priest could be found. Families praised him in whispers, grateful for his patience, blind to the weight he carried beneath his silence. They saw charity, they did not see calculation. The ledger he kept told another story. Its pages, neat and coded, listed names beside marks of circles, spirals, and numbers. To others it might look like the records of a farmer or doctor, but the symbols revealed more. How long a voice lasted, how far a body could twist before tendons tore, how the silence afterward changed the room. Each entry was another life converted into data, cruelty disguised as devotion. He called it his Book of Stillness. When suspicions stirred, Heinrich deflected with gentle acts. He donated food, though his own pantry seemed never to empty. He spoke softly to children, handed herbs to mothers, bowed his head in church with such sincerity even the preacher grew ashamed of his earlier doubts. If someone asked of the missing, he only sighed, his eyes lowering with sorrow, murmuring prayers for their return. His grief looked real enough to still the sharpest tongue. Yet behind that mask the cellar thickened with relics. The choir of jars glistened in rows, their contents humming faintly when touched by the damp wind. Bones continued to be shaped, patterns mapped across the earthen floor, slowly creeping higher along the walls. The house itself seemed complicit, its silence deeper inside than out, its walls steady even when storms shook the valley. To Heinrich it was not a hiding place but a temple, and he its priest. The town clung to denial, needing to believe in his innocence, needing the healer more than they feared the man. Evil, after all, did not wear a quiet smile. It did not mend wounds or feed the hungry. And so Heinrich's mask held firm even as the ledger filled, even as the house grew heavy with silence. To the world he was a savior. To the house he was a disciple. To himself he was both. The summer heat came dry and cruel, and with it came the fire. No one knew how it started. Some swore lightning struck the hill, others claimed a lantern was dropped. But by nightfall the Kessler farmhouse was ablaze. Flames licked the sky, turning the horizon red, drawing neighbors from miles away. They gathered at the base of the hill, helpless, watching the house burn like a pyre. The Kesslers stood outside, faces pale, but Heinrich was nowhere to be seen. When the blaze finally died, the ruins revealed more than ash. The walls had collapsed inward, exposing hidden chambers no one had known existed. Behind the charred timbers were shelves of jars, their contents burst and blackened, filling the air with a stench that silenced even the boldest men. The cellar, half-caved, showed glimpses of patterns burned into the earth, circles of bone fused by heat, spirals etched into stone itself. It was not a house they had uncovered, but something closer to a shrine, a place built for purposes no settler dared name aloud. Whispers spread fast. Mothers clutched children close, fathers crossed themselves, though faith had grown thin in those hard years. The fire had done what silence never could. It had revealed the truth. The house on the hill was not a home. It was a cage for horrors too carefully arranged to be chance. And still, Heinrich was missing. Some said he had burned. Others swore they saw him walking into the smoke, calm as ever, untouched by flame. The hill stood blackened now, its silence heavier than before, and the town carried home a new fear. The evil they had denied was no longer rumor. It had left its mark in ash and bone, and the man they had trusted, the healer with quiet eyes, had vanished into the prairie night. Weeks passed before Heinrich was found. A rancher spotted him wandering the plains at dawn, barefoot, his clothes torn and blackened with soot. He walked with no urgency, his eyes fixed on the horizon as if following something unseen. When men approached, he offered no struggle, only lifted his hands and whispered words they could not understand. Brought back to town, he sat in silence for days, refusing food, refusing water, his gaze heavy on the floorboards. When he finally spoke, his voice was hoarse but steady. He said the house had commanded him, that it whispered in the walls, in the grain of wood, in the silence between breaths. He told them he had not chosen the victims, only obeyed. The house needed voices, he said. It needed bones. It needed the spiral so it could breathe. He was only its instrument, nothing more. His words spread through the town like disease. Some called him mad, others claimed possession. But those who had seen the cellar could not shake the weight of his confession. The patterns, the jars, the silence that had lived in that house, they matched his words too closely. He spoke with no remorse, no fear of punishment, only with the calm of a man explaining work already complete. The town wanted to hang him, yet something in his manner made them hesitate. He was not wild, not raving. He was controlled, polite, as if even his confessions belonged to the house that had shaped him. And in their silence, as they debated his fate, Heinrich only smiled faintly, repeating again and again, "The house made me do it." Physicians came first, summoned from nearby towns, men with worn bags and sharper eyes who believed every madness had its root in the body. They examined Heinrich like a specimen, measuring his skull with calipers, tapping his knees with mallets, peering into his eyes for signs of fever or disease. They whispered to one another that he was a degenerate, his calmness nothing but the still mask of a fractured brain. One insisted the shape of his head proved he was born for violence. Another argued his silence was a symptom of hysteria. They left convinced science would explain him, yet their instruments revealed nothing. His pulse steady, his body healthy, his mind too ordered to match their theories. Then came the priests called by families who could not bear the thought that mere human cruelty was enough to create such horror. They entered his cell armed with crosses and Latin prayers, sprinkling holy water that darkened the wood floor. Heinrich did not resist. He only bowed his head as they pressed relics to his skin. When they demanded he renounce the devil, he replied softly, "It was not the devil. It was the house." His words unsettled them more than rage would have. They left shaken, muttering about blasphemy, unsure whether he was possessed or simply lying beyond salvation. Finally came the scholars of the new science, psychologists, men curious rather than moral, eager to prod the boundaries of the human mind. They questioned him for hours, recording his every phrase, and at last convinced him to surrender his journals. The leather-bound books, smoke-stained but intact, held diagrams of flesh stretched into spirals, notes on how nerves responded to heat, times carefully measured to the moment a voice cracked into silence. Among them were sketches of the house itself, each floor mapped not as rooms but as shapes in a larger pattern, a geometry that hinted at meaning no one wished to name. The scholars argued fiercely. Some claimed he was the product of a diseased imagination, others that he was proof of an entirely new category of mind, a man without empathy, without fear, who could kill as naturally as others prayed. But none could deny the precision of his writing. It was not the work of a raving lunatic, but of a methodical intelligence, a man who believed he was serving something greater than himself. The idea that such cruelty could be carried out not in frenzy but in calm devotion disturbed them more than possession or madness. Word spread quickly, carried by papers eager for sensation. Articles described him as the butcher of the prairie, the spiral doctor, the mad healer. Some printed excerpts from his journals, words that sent chills even on the page. Families wept as they read, recognizing patterns that matched the disappearances of their own lost. Still, Heinrich never changed his story. Whether facing physicians, priests, or scholars, his voice remained the same, soft, polite, steady. "The house made me do it," he repeated. And each time he said it, the silence in the room grew heavier, as though the house itself lingered in his words. By the end, no one agreed on what he was. Madman, monster, vessel of evil, every name was tried, but none seemed to fit. Science had no cure, religion no prayer, law no precedent. Heinrich remained calm, untouched by their judgments, a man who had peeled back the skin of suffering and called it devotion. And in the wake of their failure to define him, one truth grew impossible to ignore. Evil could be quiet, methodical, polite. It could wear the face of normalcy, and science could not explain it away. The end of Heinrich Kessler did not come with a hanging or a bullet. He was sentenced to die, yes, but the rope broke during the first attempt, and when they tried again, the crowd grew restless, convinced the act itself would unleash whatever lived behind his silence. At last, the officials decided prison would suffice. He was locked away in a stone cell far from the prairie, where he wasted slowly, his body fading but his calm never breaking. He died at 36, gaunt, quiet, his lips moving as though in prayer, though the guards swore no sound escaped. When his body was buried, no stone marked his grave. Even in death, no one wanted his name in the earth. The ruins of the Kessler house, however, remained. Though fire had gutted the walls and collapsed the roof, the cellar endured. Children dared each other to crawl inside, only to run screaming at the feel of the air. Still colder than outside, still heavy with the scent of ash and rot decades later. Farmers refused to plow near it, the land around the hill left to grow wild. For generations, the hill was a scar, the story whispered around hearths when the wind pressed too hard against windows. They said if you listened at night, you could hear faint humming beneath the soil, as though the choir Heinrich built had never stopped. In time, reform came. Newspapers spread his story beyond South Dakota, their lurid descriptions sparking debates about the nature of evil. Lawmakers cited the case when calling for better asylums, for institutions to house minds too dangerous for simple jails. Physicians who studied his journals laid the groundwork for what would later be called criminal psychology. Their notes the seed of an idea that monsters could wear ordinary faces. Even the clergy spoke of him from pulpits, though always cautiously, using his name as a warning of what silence could hide. Yet none of this erased the unease. The townspeople could not agree on what had truly happened. Some clung to the belief that Heinrich was mad, a broken mind lost to science. Others whispered darker things, that the house itself had been alive, that it had fed on his cruelty and rewarded him with silence too deep for ordinary men to bear. The patterns burned into the cellar walls were never fully explained, their geometry too precise, too deliberate to dismiss as mere scratching. Whatever the truth, the land never forgot. The hill grew thick with weeds, its soil bare of crops, its silence untouched. Even birds avoided it still. As decades passed, scholars and writers returned, eager to examine what remained. They uncovered fragments of Heinrich's ledgers, soot-stained pages still legible. They wrote of his obsession with spirals, with the harvest of voices, with the belief that suffering could shape the breath of a house. To modern minds, his rituals seemed insane. Yet beneath the madness lay a method too careful to ignore, a mind that sought order in cruelty, a man who gave meaning to horror by binding it into design. His legacy was not only the bodies he left behind, but the question he forced the world to face. What if evil was not chaos but order? Not rage but silence? In South Dakota, the town that once feared him tried to move on. A memorial was raised, not for Heinrich, but for the missing, the farmhands, the wives, the children who never returned. Their names carved into stone stood against the prairie wind, a list of voices stolen but not forgotten. Families gathered there on anniversaries, laying flowers, telling stories, refusing to let silence claim them again. Yet even at the memorial, the hill could be seen in the distance, a black outline against the sky, reminding them that some silence cannot be erased. And so the story of Heinrich Kessler outlived the man. His name appeared in textbooks on criminology, in sermons about sin, in whispered tales meant to scare children into obedience. But more than any of that, his story became a warning. Evil did not always come with fire or fury. It did not always scream. Sometimes it wore the face of a healer, the smile of a neighbor, the hands of a man trusted by all. Sometimes it lived in silence, waiting in walls, feeding on trust, growing in shadows until it revealed itself too late. The prairie still holds that silence. On still nights, some say the air feels heavier near the hill, pressing against the skin, carrying a breath not your own. And when the wind moves low across the grass, it can sound like humming, faint and distant, a reminder of voices taken long ago. Whether it is only memory or something that lingers, no one can say. But the story forces the question: how does evil survive? Not by shouting, but by whispering, not by being seen, but by hiding in plain sight. Heinrich's legacy was not only horror, but revelation. He showed how institutions, family, church, community can protect a monster as long as he wears the mask of innocence. He showed how silence can be more dangerous than violence, how denial feeds cruelty more than hunger ever could. His life ended, his house burned, but the questions remained heavier than stone. What if we cannot explain evil? What if it does not need explanation, only opportunity? And that is what lingers most, not the bones, not the jars, not even the ruined cellar. It is the realization that a man could walk among us, polite, soft-spoken, trusted. And behind that calm shape, suffering into order, devotion into death. The house on the hill is gone, but its silence is not. It waits in every place where fear keeps people quiet, where suspicion goes unspoken, where trust blinds us to the shadows moving close. What do you think? Could this happen again? Could a man like Heinrich, polite and methodical, hide in plain sight today? Could another house in another town still be listening?